Why are the people of Abraham divided? People don't seem to give that much thought in the Western world. We do know, because of the activity of Al-Qaeda and other sadistic groups, that a division between Israel and the Arab people, as well as Muslims and others, do exist. Now, one might ask, is Ishmael in the Old Testament called a wild ass of a man? Well, let's remember that that is a man. Notice, is the designee there. We tend to read that corporately as if it belongs to all Muslims or all Arabs or all Shiites because of the trouble in the Middle East. As Westerners, many parts of this equation don't really ring or resonate as very relevant to us because we are not dealing with battles that are several thousand-year-old struggles between the conquest of the Arab people, which were the fifth son of Shem. So all of the Arab people that come from the fifth son of Shem are Semites. So they are Semitic people. It's interesting in the 1890s when scholars began to try and recover biblical Hebrew. We had to go back to many of the Bedouin tribes and rediscover what a lot of their roots were in the general Semitic group of languages, and to understand the world that was the precursor of the Hebrew people. Abraham may have been the father of the Hebrew people, but he was also the father of all of the people of the Middle East because he was not Jewish. I know that comes as a shock to many people, but even in our biblical text, it says, my, parents were a wandering Aramean and a Hittite. So that's one link. And of course, you have another link through the fifth son of Shem, and you have another link through Ishmael. So not all Arabs are of Ishmael. And we need to understand that particular designation as well, and go back and pick up the descendants of these people from Genesis chapter 49. There were also dwelling rights that were fought over in the days of Abraham, and tithes were given to Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem, not Jesus, as some of the old-time American Pentecostals have said, but it was probably Shem who was given tithes and offerings to after the First World War in biblical times was completed. And what did Abram do, or Abraham? Went back to where? Damascus? Wow. Read the promise in Deuteronomy 24:25 and especially chapter 26, and you come up with the idea of, in Damascus, Abraham was very wealthy and he had descendants there. And of course, later on in the documents of Ebla, found in 1927, were retranslated, and the site began to be excavated further in 1955, we also see that Abraham had a whole caravan of people when he went back to Damascus. We never really understood why. Well, there were two Urs, not only of the Chaldees, but in southern Babylonia. And we could never make these trade routes quite work in a scholastic or scholarly sense until we figured that out. And that's been a very recent discovery. But what do we do with the Arabic book of Psalms that Allah translates just fine from Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh? Some are under the false notion that Allah is the moon god, but the moon god of Islam is subservient to Allah. And so what you have in the flags of the Middle East is their national deity, who they pay honor or homage to, who protects them under their calendrical cycle and who answers to Allah. A lot of people are under the false notion that Allah is a different God, but they mix Allah up with the tyrannical or territorial God, or the moon god in a cosmic sense, who is, of course, subservient to the ultimate deity in Islam, who is Allah. What about Ihad or Jihad? Well, that concept is, of course, something that has many different meanings. Clear to a world apocalyptic jihad, clear to the jihad that is inside of all of us to do right and wrong. And the Hebraic counterpart is the 27 degrees between absolute right and absolute wrong. And that most of us operate between law and ethics somewhere kind of in the middle. And that is where halakhic man, or the completed man, wants to be, is totally embracing the law and ethics. And the Arabs have their counterparts to this in the surahs as well. But do we worship the same God? Well, we have the same God historically. Is the three monotheistic religions, writes Peters from Princeton, really the same expression of faith? Well, I wouldn't say they are identical, but I would say that our father is Abraham, and we are definitely all three monotheistic: Christian thought and Islam thought, and of course Hebrew thought does indeed compass around the circumference of the one God concept. Now, what about the dwelling rights that existed in ancient times? Who has a right to the particular property of Israel and Canaan, and of course the Golan Heights? We know that early on in Genesis chapter 16 and 17, there was a great promise given to the Arab people. They were to, receive everything from southern Babylonia and all the way up into the Middle Eastern area near Jerusalem. Then you had Israel was to receive everything between the two great rivers, the Nile and the Tigris. The Arabs were to have 12 princes, and of course, the Jews, or the people of Judah, or Yahudah, or Yuhadim, the people of Judah, were to have, indeed, 12 tribes. So there were 12 parcels of land and 12 tribes within tribal formation. This was never realized in prophetic history or in natural history for either Israel or the Arab people. So these prophecies were never fully realized, and that's part of the reason we have the battles to this day. Arabic scholars are quick to point out that once you homestead or inhabit a place of residence in the Middle East, and this is Sassaran Treaty rights as well, for more than 10 years, and you homestead it, it's yours. And that is something that very few people in the West understand. Now, it goes back to land grants and land decrees that were given in the book of Genesis that were never fully realized. So once again, why is Abraham divided? Well, because his family is divided. Daniel C. Peterson studied the early church patristics during the period of the fathers of the desert in the early parts of the Christian era. And he found out that through the gospel, these particular peoples were to be united in their Messiah. That never happened either. And the work of the church through the gospel message was to work at restoring their birthright promise for the Hebrew people under Judah and for Israel under Joseph. And the other was to be restored with the recovery of the land grant that was given to the 12 princes. Did you hear it? Another fine book to consider if you're going to do some of these studies. It's from Ze'ev W. Falk, and it's entitled Hebrew Law in Biblical Times. And it gives the ethics, the biblical scriptures, and the quotations, as well as many of the Mishnaic and other Talmudic references that can be utilized to get the larger picture in a Middle Eastern context. It is well worth your time to peruse it and become very familiar with it, because if you do not understand what is going on in the Middle East in our time, then you're darn sure not going to understand what went on years ago as antecedents to the current conflict. What has also aided and abetted the conflicts have been Western powers and their desire for oil and to redraw the map of the Near East, starting, of course, in 1917 with the British occupation of Jerusalem. So, who is our father Abraham? He is the father of the Jews, but also of the faithful. And he is indeed our father because of his acts of faith that he performed. And through the Messiah, we are indeed Abraham's children, according to the blessing, according to Galatians chapter 5. We have a long way to go to ever fulfill these particular prophecies. Biblical scholars are divided in whether or not they will ever be fulfilled or will they be in the kingdom age. This is something that the Messiah will have to divide and separate and bless after his second coming in the new world. Until that time, this is Father Tom Roberts saying, good listening.